At Goldman Sachs, there's an unwritten rule. Before you're allowed to leave the office, you personally walk to every single person on your team and ask if they need help finishing anything. It doesn't matter if you were the first one in that morning. Skip that step, and you're quietly labeled as not a team player by people who were also there before you. That detail came out of a bigger question from someone who'd spent over a decade inside American multinational companies, watching colleagues work with what he called ferocious intensity, rarely slacking, constantly taking initiative, intensely competitive, in a way that genuinely impressed him. His actual question was simple: is it just the at-will employment laws, or is something deeper going on? The very first answer from someone else entirely wasn't a law or a policy. It was one word: busy. In America, when you ask someone how they're doing, busy isn't necessarily true. It's often just the polite, expected answer. The same way fine, thanks works everywhere else. Being visibly busy is treated as a kind of quiet virtue, whether or not there's actually anything urgent going on. And that single word ends up explaining a lot more than small talk, because it points straight at something people admitted feeling guilty about, even on their own time off. One person described feeling low-grade guilt on weekends if they weren't doing some kind of chore or errand, even something completely non-urgent. Another described a very specific recurring scene at their in-laws' house. Sit down to read a book for 15 minutes, and someone in the family will comment in a tone somewhere between joking and disapproving. There he is reading a book as if relaxing needed to be justified out loud. This is the part that gets me every time I reread this thread. One commenter, a CFO of her own company, described her husband catching her mid-relaxation on an actually well-earned Saturday morning, and her own first instinct was to say, out loud, "I should be doing something." Not because anything was wrong, just because stillness itself felt like it needed an excuse. Then the Goldman Sachs story landed, and it reframed the entire conversation from cultural quirk into something a lot closer to an actual, enforced workplace expectation. Someone described a friend working there who every single evening had to personally check in with every teammate before leaving, regardless of how early he'd arrived that morning. Skip that ritual and he'd be quietly filed away as not a team player. Multiple people chimed in agreeing this happens across plenty of American industries, not just finance. Nobody individually wants to stay late, but nobody wants to be the one who visibly leaves first either. So the whole group ends up staying anyway. And there's a genuinely dark flip side buried in the replies from someone working in research. When a couple of new hires started blowing through their quota by tripling their normal output, management didn't investigate how. They just raised the quota for everyone, 3 separate times. The actual answer turned out to be quality control corners getting cut. Discovered only months later, reward speed without checking the cost. And speed becomes the only thing measured. So where does this specific flavor of relentlessness actually come from? A lot of people in the thread reached for the exact same historical explanation. The Puritans came up constantly, an old religious idea essentially that hard work itself is a kind of virtue, almost proof of moral worth, layered on top of generations of immigrants who quite literally crossed an ocean with nothing and built a life through sheer labor. One person connected it directly to family stories, grandparents who arrived with barely the clothes on their back, and an unspoken expectation that their descendants honor that sacrifice by working just as hard. But underneath the history, there's a much colder, much more modern mechanism doing a lot of the actual work. One word that came up over and over, at will, in every American state except one: an employer can fire you for almost any reason with zero notice and walk you out of the building within minutes. No required severance, no mandatory notice period. Compare that to a lot of European countries, where notice periods, severance pay, and formal procedures are built into law, and the entire risk calculation on both sides of the Atlantic looks completely different. And once you add money into that same equation, work hard, get rewarded stops being a platitude and starts looking like an actual functioning incentive system, at least for some people. One engineer described starting in building design and construction at $53,000 a year, working voluntary unpaid overtime for roughly 7 years straight. Today, he makes $325,000 annually and owns a percentage of the engineering company itself. Someone else made an even sharper comparison. A second-year airline pilot in the US flying short regional hops can earn roughly $150,000 a year, comparable to what a pilot flying international routes for a major Gulf carrier makes, despite the wildly different scope of the job. Climb the ladder in an American company, and the ceiling on what that climb pays out is often dramatically higher than in most of Europe. That kind of trajectory takes real years to build, obviously, but the fact that it's possible at all is exactly what keeps a lot of people pushing, which is exactly why healthcare came up so often in this thread. Because in America, that entire ladder is built directly on top of your job, in a way that doesn't really exist in most other developed countries. lose your job in the US, and in a lot of cases, you lose your health coverage on the exact same day. Multiple commenters connected that single fact directly to the country's work culture. It's not really about ambition when your health insurance, your ability to see a doctor, and your family's financial stability are all tied to the same job you're afraid to underperform in. And a couple of very specific international comparisons in this thread hit especially hard because they weren't theoretical. They came from people who'd actually managed teams on both sides. One American engineer, comparing notes with a colleague in the London office, discovered he was earning roughly twice the salary of a new graduate hire doing similar work, while working genuinely fewer total hours. The catch: his UK counterparts left the office at exactly 4 o'clock, even mid-call with a client, and would announce a 3-week vacation to Ibiza the day before leaving, with zero handoff plan, expecting the client to simply wait. In his own office, that would have been considered wildly unprofessional. In theirs, it was completely normal. Someone else described managing a factory in Italy, where the entire management team disappeared for lunch for close to 5 hours, refusing to adjust their schedule even slightly to accommodate calls with the American office at 3 in the morning their time. Eventually, the company simply relocated that plant overseas entirely, not necessarily because Italian workers were bad at their jobs, but because the two work cultures genuinely couldn't operate on the same clock. One comparison even hit closer to home for one commenter personally. A friend transferred from an American tech job in Washington state to an office in Germany and took a 60% pay cut in the process. Her plan apparently was to come back within 3 years, hopefully with a promotion waiting for her. And underneath every single one of those comparisons is a genuinely blunt statistic Americans across the whole thread kept quoting to explain the entire national mood. The productivity per person in the UK, according to one frequently cited figure, is roughly equivalent to that of Mississippi, one of the lowest productivity states in the entire United States. Whether or not that specific number holds up under scrutiny, the fact that it gets repeated constantly tells you something about how Americans measure themselves, not against comfort, but against output. And that measuring stick cuts both ways, painfully. One person, 8 years into unpaid overtime and constant extra projects, described watching a newer hire get promoted right past her instead, with a certificate of recognition as her only consolation prize. Someone else replying called it, only half-jokingly, a villain origin story. Work hard in America, and the reward is sometimes an actual promotion, sometimes it's just more work, quietly handed to the person who's already proven they won't say no. So stack all of it together. The Puritan reverence for hard work, the at-will law that can end a career with zero notice, the tax and healthcare system tied entirely to employment, and a pay ceiling genuinely high enough to make the whole gamble worth taking for some people. And busy stops sounding like small talk. It starts sounding like the honest, compressed version of an entire country's operating manual, work like the ground underneath you could disappear tomorrow. Because in a very literal legal sense, it actually can. If a country can build an entire work culture around the fear of an empty Tuesday, wait until you hear the surprisingly emotional reason Americans move house almost every single year. Same underlying restlessness, completely different subject. Tell me in the comments, does your culture reward working hard, or does it look down on it?